He thought her clothes made her invisible, but in less than 10 minutes, everyone in that room would wish they had never looked at her that way. The crystal chandeliers of Whitmore Avenue's most exclusive boutique casting soft golden light across polished marble floors as Claire Whitman stepped inside, her worn gray sweater and simple jeans standing in quiet contrast to the tailored suits and designer gowns surrounding her. Conversation slowed just slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough to be felt. Eyes drifting, lingering, measuring, the kind of silent judgment that never needed words. Claire moved calmly between the displays, her fingers brushing lightly against a silk dress priced higher than most people's monthly rent, her expression unreadable, steady, as if she belonged in a way no one else could see. Near the center of the store, a sales associate paused mid-conversation, her polite smile tightening just a fraction as her gaze traveled from Claire's scuffed sneakers to her unbranded sweater, calculating, dismissing, deciding. "Can I help you?" she asked, though her tone suggested the opposite. Claire turned slightly, meeting her eyes with quiet composure. "I'm looking for something appropriate for an event tonight," she said, her voice soft but clear, the kind that didn't compete for attention yet somehow held it. The associate hesitated, glancing toward a well-dressed couple nearby before forcing a thinner smile. "Our pieces start around $3,000, she replied, each word carefully enunciated, as if clarifying something obvious. A faint chuckle drifted from somewhere behind them. Quickly stifled, Claire nodded once, unfazed, her gaze drifting back to the dresses as though the number meant nothing at all. And that was what unsettled them most. She didn't argue, didn't shrink, didn't explain herself. She simply existed in the space with a quiet certainty that didn't match what they saw. Across the room, the store manager watched, arms crossed, his expression sharpening as he noticed the subtle shift in attention, the whispers, the glances, the disruption of what he considered order. He stepped forward, each polished shoe striking the marble with deliberate authority, already preparing the words he believed would put everything back in place. Unaware that with every step he took toward her, he was walking directly into a moment that would unravel everything he thought he understood about power, presence, and the dangerous mistake of judging someone before they ever speak. The manager stopped just a few feet from Claire, his shadow stretching across the polished floor as the low murmur of the boutique slowly faded into a tense, expectant silence. He offered a tight smile that never reached his eyes, the kind perfected through years of quiet exclusion. "Ma'am," he began, his voice smooth but edged with impatience. "This is a private showroom experience. We cater to a very specific clientele." His gaze briefly swept over her outfit again, reinforcing the unspoken message. Claire turned to face him fully now, her posture relaxed, her expression calm, as if she had heard variations of this sentence 100 times before and had already decided how it would end. "I understand," she replied softly, her voice steady, which only seemed to irritate him further because it gave him nothing to push against. Around them, a few customers slowed their browsing, pretending to remain occupied while their attention sharpened, drawn to the subtle tension building in the air. The sales associate from earlier shifted uncomfortably but said nothing, her earlier confidence replaced with curiosity. The manager took a small step closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound controlled while still ensuring others could hear. "Perhaps you would be more comfortable at one of our outlet locations," he suggested, though the suggestion carried no warmth, only dismissal. A faint ripple of quiet laughter moved through the nearby displays, quickly masked but not unnoticed. Claire's eyes moved across the room for a brief moment, taking in the chandeliers, the mirrored walls, the carefully curated luxury that seemed so fragile beneath the surface. Then her gaze returned to him, calm, unwavering. "I am exactly where I need to be," she said, and for a split second something in her tone caused a flicker of uncertainty to cross his face before it hardened again. He exhaled slowly, patience thinning. "I am going to have to ask you to leave," he said more firmly now, straightening his jacket as if reclaiming authority. The words landed heavier this time, no longer disguised as polite suggestion. The room stilled. Conversations paused completely. Even the soft background music seemed distant. Claire did not move immediately, and that pause stretched just long enough to make everyone aware of it. Then she nodded once. A small, almost imperceptible motion, as if acknowledging something far beyond the moment itself. She turned toward the entrance, her steps unhurried, measured, the quiet echo of her shoes against marble marking each second like a countdown no one else understood. Behind her, the tension began to release. A few customers exchanged knowing looks. The associate let out a subtle breath, and the manager adjusted his cuffs with a faint sense of restored control, believing the situation had resolved. Exactly as expected, believing the order of the room had been restored, unaware that the silence she left behind was not defeat, but something far more dangerous, because as Claire reached the glass doors and placed her hand on the handle, the world outside was already moving toward her, and everything inside that boutique was about to change. The glass door had barely begun to open when a sleek black car pulled up to the curb with quiet precision, its polished surface reflecting the boutique's golden lights like a mirror, and for a moment no one inside paid attention until the driver stepped out swiftly, opening the rear door with practiced urgency. Two sharply dressed individuals followed, their movements efficient, purposeful, completely out of sync with the relaxed luxury atmosphere inside. Claire paused just beyond the threshold, her hand still resting lightly on the handle as if she had been expecting this exact moment down to the second. Behind her, the manager frowned slightly, irritation flickering across his face at what he assumed was an unnecessary disruption. One of the men entered first, scanning the room before his eyes landed on Claire, relief immediately softening his otherwise composed expression. "Ms. Whitman," he said, his voice clear, respectful, carrying just enough to reach every corner of the boutique. The room shifted, subtly at first, then all at once. Conversation stopped completely, the air tightening as attention redirected. The manager's posture stiffened, confusion replacing confidence as the name echoed in his mind. Claire turned back slowly, her expression unchanged, calm as ever. "You are late," she said quietly, not harsh, but firm enough to signal expectation. The second man stepped forward quickly, holding a leather portfolio close to his chest. "We apologize. The legal team needed final confirmation on the acquisition documents," he explained, his tone professional, deferential. The word acquisition seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, drawing invisible lines between people who understood its weight and those who did not. The sales associate's eyes widened slightly, her earlier certainty dissolving into uncertainty. The manager took a small step forward, his mind racing to reframe what he was seeing. "Excuse me," he interjected, attempting to regain control. "Is there some kind of misunderstanding here?" His voice no longer as steady as before. Claire shifted her gaze toward him, and for the first time there was something different in her eyes. Not anger, not arrogance, but clarity, the kind that left no room for doubt. "No misunderstanding," she replied, her voice even, as if stating something already decided. She took a step back into the boutique, no longer as a guest, but with a presence that quietly redefined the space itself. The man beside her opened the portfolio, revealing neatly arranged documents. "As of this morning, the Whitman Group has completed the full acquisition of this brand and all its retail locations," he announced, each word landing with precise weight. The room went completely silent, the kind of silence that pressed against the walls, the chandeliers, the polished floors. The manager froze mid-breath, his earlier authority dissolving into something unrecognizable. The customers who had watched with mild curiosity now stood motionless, caught between disbelief and realization. Claire's gaze moved slowly across the room, not searching for reactions, but observing them, measuring something deeper, and then it settled back on the manager, steady, composed. "I believe we were discussing who belongs here," she said softly. And in that moment, no one in the room could remember who had been laughing just minutes before. The manager's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out, his confidence unraveling in real time as the weight of what he had just heard settled over him. The polished certainty he had worn moments ago now replaced with something far more fragile, uncertainty edged with fear. Around him, the boutique seemed to hold its breath, every customer suddenly aware that they were witnessing something irreversible. The kind of moment that redraws lines people thought were permanent. The sales associate, who had dismissed Claire earlier, now stood frozen near the display table, her hands clasped too tightly, her eyes flickering between Claire and the documents as if searching for any sign that this could still be undone. But there was none. Claire remained still at the center of it all, her presence no longer blending into the background, but quietly commanding the space without effort. She did not raise her voice, did not step forward aggressively. She simply existed with a calm authority that made everything else feel smaller. "This location has strong potential," she said, her tone thoughtful rather than emotional, as if the earlier humiliation had already been filed away into something irrelevant. But potential is wasted when respect is treated as optional. Her words were not directed at anyone in particular, yet they seemed to land directly on the manager, who instinctively straightened his posture as though trying to recover something that had already slipped away. "Ms. Whitman, I can explain," he said quickly, his voice tightening as he forced composure back into place. But even as he spoke, the imbalance between them was unmistakable. Claire turned her head slightly, acknowledging him without urgency, giving him just enough attention to speak, and that small gesture made the room even quieter. "There must have been a misunderstanding," he continued, his words carefully chosen now, stripped of the earlier arrogance. "We maintain very high standards here, and sometimes that requires difficult decisions in the moment." The explanation hung in the air, thin and unconvincing, the kind of justification built for situations that no longer existed. Claire listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, which somehow made it worse, because it denied him any signal that he was regaining control. When he finished, the silence returned, heavier than before. She took a single step forward, not threatening, not dramatic, just enough to close the distance between perception and reality. "Standards are important," she said quietly, her voice steady and clear. "But they reveal more about those who enforce them than those they are enforced on." The sentence settled over the room with a quiet finality, no raised tone, no anger, just truth delivered without decoration. The manager's shoulders lowered slightly, the fight draining out of him as the realization fully set in. Around them the customers shifted subtly, no longer spectators, but witnesses to something they would remember long after they left. Claire's gaze moved briefly across the boutique once more, not judging, not condemning, simply observing. And then she looked back at the manager, her voice softer now, but somehow even more decisive. "We will begin with leadership review effective immediately," she said, and in that moment, no one doubted that everything in that room had just changed in a way that could not be reversed. The chandeliers still glowed, the marble floors still reflected the light, but the illusion that appearance defined worth had quietly, completely collapsed. No one moved for several seconds after her words settled, as if the entire room needed time to adjust to a reality that no longer matched what they had believed just moments ago. The manager's hands, once confidently folded, now hung uncertainly at his sides, his carefully constructed authority stripped down to something fragile and exposed. The sales associate lowered her gaze, unable to meet Claire's eyes. The quiet weight of recognition, pressing heavier than any spoken reprimand. Claire did not rush the moment. She allowed the silence to do its work, her presence steady, grounded, as though she understood that true change did not come from raised voices, but from undeniable clarity. She turned slightly toward the displays again, her fingers brushing once more against the fabric of a dress, the same gesture as before, but now the room watched it differently, not with judgment, but with awareness. "This piece," she said calmly, lifting a simple yet elegant garment from the rack, "is well made, understated. It does not need to announce its value to be recognized." Her voice carried gently, yet every word seemed to reach exactly where it needed to. She glanced briefly toward the sales associate, not accusing, not harsh, simply present. "That is what real luxury is," she added, placing the dress back with care. The associate nodded faintly, her earlier assumptions dissolving into something quieter, more reflective. Claire then faced the room once more, her gaze passing over each person without lingering, not seeking apology, not demanding acknowledgement, but leaving behind something more lasting than either. "We will implement new training across all locations," she said, her tone composed, decisive. "Not for product knowledge, but for something far more important. The manager swallowed subtly, already understanding what was coming before she said it. Respect. Claire finished, the word simple, unadorned, yet heavier than anything else spoken that day. Outside, the city continued as it always had, unaware of the quiet shift that had just taken place inside those glass walls. Claire stepped toward the entrance again, but this time no one mistook her movement for retreat. It carried purpose, closure, the natural end of something that had already been decided. Her team followed without question, the door opening smoothly as light from the street spilled in, and for a brief moment it illuminated the room in a way that made everything feel clearer, sharper, more honest. She paused just before stepping out, not turning back fully, but just enough for her voice to carry one final time, calm, certain. What you choose to see in others will always reveal more about you than it does about them. And then she walked out, leaving behind a silence that no one rushed to fill, because for the first time, they understood that silence was not emptiness, it was reflection, and that day, in that quiet, polished room, something far more valuable than any item on display had finally been revealed. The door closed softly behind Claire, and for a moment no one inside the boutique spoke, not because they did not know what to say, but because they suddenly understood that words would only expose how little they had truly seen before. The manager remained where he stood, staring at the space she had just occupied, his reflection faintly visible in the polished floor beneath him. But it felt unfamiliar now, as if he were seeing himself through someone else's eyes for the first time. The sales associate slowly exhaled, her shoulders lowering as the tension drained, yet something heavier replaced it. A quiet realization that lingered longer than embarrassment ever could. Around them customers began to shift again, but their movements were different now, slower, more thoughtful. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, no longer filled with casual confidence, but with something closer to reflection. The boutique itself had not changed. The chandeliers still cast their warm glow, the racks still displayed the same carefully curated pieces, but the meaning of it all felt altered, as if the illusion that had once held it together had been gently, but completely, dismantled. The manager finally moved, adjusting his jacket out of habit. Though the gesture no longer carried authority, only uncertainty, he glanced toward the associate, then toward the door, as if expecting something else to happen, but nothing did. The moment had already passed, and what remained was its consequence. "We need to review everything," he said quietly, his voice no longer commanding but searching. The associate nodded, though she understood that this was not about policies or procedures. It was about something far less visible and far more difficult to change. Outside, Claire walked down the sidewalk with the same calm pace she had carried inside, her team following at a respectful distance, the city noise blending into a steady rhythm around her. Cars passing, voices overlapping, life continuing as it always did. Yet for her, there was no sense of victory, no satisfaction in what had just unfolded, only a quiet certainty that the outcome had been necessary. One of her associates stepped slightly closer. "The board is ready for your call," he said, but she did not respond immediately, her gaze lifting briefly toward the buildings ahead, their glass surfaces reflecting the afternoon light. "Reschedule it for 1 hour," she replied finally, her voice calm. "There are a few changes I want to consider first." The associate nodded without question, falling back into step. Claire continued walking, her expression unchanged, composed, thoughtful, as if the events of the last few minutes were already being placed into a larger perspective, not as an isolated moment, but as part of something ongoing, something that would extend far beyond a single boutique on a single street. Behind her, inside that polished space, people would remember this day not because of who she was, but because of what they had revealed about themselves, and that realization would stay with them far longer than any display, any price tag, or any carefully constructed image ever could. And somewhere between the silence she left behind and the steps she took forward, the difference between appearance and truth had finally become impossible to ignore. An hour later, the boutique no longer felt like the same place. Even though nothing visible had changed, the same chandeliers glowed overhead, the same polished marble reflected every movement, the same carefully arranged displays stood untouched, yet something invisible had shifted beneath it all, like a foundation quietly realigned. The manager stood in his office at the back, the door slightly open. His reflection caught in the glass frame as he stared at the documents now resting on his desk, copies of the acquisition confirmation that left no room for reinterpretation, no space for denial. His earlier confidence now seemed distant, almost unrecognizable, replaced by a lingering awareness that the moment he thought he controlled had in fact revealed more about him than he had ever intended. Out on the floor, the sales associate moved more carefully now, her interactions slower, her tone softer. Each customer met not with assumption but with attention, as if she were relearning something that should have always been there. A quiet humility replacing the automatic judgments that once guided her. A new customer entered, dressed simply, nothing outwardly remarkable, and for a brief moment the associate paused, the old instinct flickering. But this time it did not take hold. "Welcome," she said sincerely, her voice steady, and though the word was simple, it carried a different weight now, one built on awareness rather than appearance. Across the store, subtle changes continued, small, almost invisible adjustments in behavior, posture, tone, the kind that could not be enforced by policy alone but had to be understood. Outside, Claire sat in the back seat of the car as it moved steadily through the city streets, the skyline stretching ahead in clean lines of glass and steel, her tablet resting in her hands, filled with reports, numbers, projections, yet her attention was not on the data. It lingered instead on the moment that had unfolded earlier, not with frustration, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. One of her advisors glanced back briefly. "The restructuring proposals are ready for review," he said. But Claire only nodded slightly, her gaze still distant. "We will proceed," she replied, her tone calm, measured, but not just with numbers, she added, almost to herself, because she understood something many overlooked, that systems could be rebuilt, processes could be improved, but culture, the quiet way people chose to see each other, required something deeper, something intentional. The car slowed at a red light, and for a moment the city seemed to pause around her, people crossing the street, conversations overlapping, lives intersecting in ways that rarely noticed each other. Claire looked out the window, her reflection faint against the glass, and in that reflection there was no trace of the woman they had laughed at, nor the authority they had feared, only a quiet steadiness, the same presence that had walked into that boutique without needing to announce itself, because true presence never needed permission. And as the light turned green and the car moved forward again, what remained behind was not just a lesson for those who had witnessed it, but a shift already beginning to ripple outward, subtle, unseen, but undeniable. Because sometimes the most powerful changes do not arrive loudly, they arrive quietly, and once they do, nothing ever returns to exactly what it was before. By the next morning, the boutique opened its doors to the same street, the same passing traffic, the same rhythm of the city, yet for those inside, nothing felt routine anymore. The manager arrived earlier than usual, standing alone for a moment beneath the chandeliers before anyone else entered, the silence heavier than it had ever been, not empty, but filled with the memory of what had unfolded. He walked the floor slowly, not inspecting displays, but observing the space itself as if seeing it clearly for the first time, each reflection in the marble, each carefully arranged piece, each corner where assumptions had once lived unnoticed, and for the first time, he did not feel in control of it, but responsible for it. When the staff arrived, their greetings were quieter, more deliberate, the easy confidence replaced with awareness, not fear, but something closer to accountability. The sales associate paused at the entrance before stepping in, taking a small breath as though crossing into something new, her posture straighter, her expression more open, the shift subtle, but real. Throughout the morning, customers came and went, some dressed in luxury, others in simplicity, but the difference in how they were treated was no longer visible. Each interaction measured, attentive, respectful, not because it was being enforced, but because it had been understood, and that difference carried through every word, every glance, every gesture. Late in the afternoon, a woman entered wearing a plain jacket and worn shoes, her presence quiet, almost hesitant, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to remember. But this time, no one looked away, no one hesitated. The associate stepped forward with a calm, genuine smile. "Welcome," she said, and the word landed differently now, no longer filtered through assumption, but offered freely. The woman returned the smile, small but real, and something in that exchange shifted the room once more, a quieter shift, but just as meaningful. In her office across the city, Claire reviewed a report summarizing the first day after the acquisition. The numbers were steady, the projections unchanged, but it was the notes at the bottom that held her attention. Observations about staff behavior, customer interactions, subtle changes that could not be quantified but were impossible to ignore. She read them carefully, her expression thoughtful, then set the tablet down, her reflection faint in the glass window beside her. Outside, the city stretched endlessly, filled with moments just like the one she had walked into the day before, moments where people decided, often without realizing it, what others were worth. And in that quiet realization, she understood that what had happened was not just about a single store, but about something much larger, something that repeated itself in countless places every day. The difference was that now, at least in one corner of that world, the pattern had been interrupted, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that left no space for it to return unnoticed. And as the light shifted across the buildings outside, Claire allowed herself a small pause, not to reflect on what had been corrected, but on what could still be changed, because the real work was never in the moment of revelation, it was in what followed after, in the quiet choices made when no one was watching. And in that understanding, the story did not end. It simply moved forward, carried not by power, but by awareness. Weeks passed, and what had begun as a single moment of quiet disruption settled into something deeper, something lasting. The boutique no longer carried the same invisible weight it once had, not because of rules posted or policies rewritten, but because of the subtle, consistent choices made each day by those within it. The manager no longer stood at the center with unquestioned authority. Instead, he moved through the space with awareness, his voice measured, his decisions no longer driven by appearance, but by understanding. The sales associate who once hesitated now greeted every customer with the same steady respect, her tone genuine, her attention present, and over time, the change became something customers could feel even if they could not explain it. The atmosphere lighter, more open, as if the space itself had exhaled. One afternoon, a familiar figure paused across the street. Watching quietly through the glass, Claire Whitman stood still for a moment, her reflection blending with the movement of the city behind her. She did not step inside, did not announce her presence. She simply observed, the interactions unfolding naturally, a customer dressed in designer clothing being assisted with care, another in simple attire receiving the same attention. No hesitation, no shift in tone, no trace of the old pattern that had once defined the place. And for the first time, there was nothing for her to correct, nothing to interrupt. She allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible nod, not of approval, but of recognition, then turned and continued walking, disappearing back into the rhythm of the city without drawing attention. Inside, no one noticed she had been there. And that was precisely the point, because the true measure of change was not how people behaved when they were being watched, but who they chose to be when they believed no one was. The chandeliers continued to glow. The marble floors still reflected every movement. But the meaning of those reflections had changed, no longer distorting worth through appearance, but quietly mirroring something more honest. And somewhere between the silence that once filled the room and the quiet respect that replaced it, a lesson had taken root. Not spoken, not written, but lived. That dignity was never something given by status, and respect was never something earned by appearance. It was something chosen, moment by moment, in the way one person saw another, and on that day, without announcement, without applause, the world in that small corner remembered what that choice looked like.